What's up, everybody? Welcome to 10x Recruiting. This is our first episode. Sile, today we talked to Jordan Mazer. What were your learnings from this conversation with Jordan?
The things that really stood out for me is he has, rightly or wrongly, made peace with this idea that he's starting from a deficit in your relationship often with hiring managers. And like almost your job as a recruiter is to address that deficit and get to the point where you're seen as a peer and seen as super valuable as quickly as possible. Again, that's like a philosophical thing, but it obviously results in a very tactical approach to starting working with your hiring manager. You guys jammed a bit on this. Why is interviewing not seen as like an important part of someone's almost performance? Not recruiters, like the hiring team. Like, why isn't interviewing seen as a key contribution to the organization you're working for? Really big takeaway there really was understanding what is the context of your company. Are you in a company where there is a great culture towards hiring and people do understand this is one of the most important things they're doing? Because if so, that obviously changes your approach. Or are you in a company where it's not seen as that? Actually, it's seen as something that sort of gets in the way of the day-to-day operations. And that's going to obviously bring about massively different tactics of how to achieve great hiring in a company as well.
All right, so here are mine. And our first one's the same, but I will frame it as the formula for building trust starts by proving value. If you think about it in the context of recruiting, specifically what Jordan said is because there's so many bad recruiters, you start in this deficit. And then he goes on to say, like, even at Andreessen, right? He's at Andreessen Horowitz, arguably one of the best VCs in the world. He has to prove to founders that he's just not another recruiter. And the way he does that is by delivering value. So that's in the form of amazing source candidates, candidates that are active right now that are like perfect for the company, those sorts of things. And I just love that formula of like how you build trust is by proving value. The other one for me is interviewers are not assessors of the candidate's fitness for the role. The hiring manager is the go, no go, right? They provide the actual hiring recommendation. The interviewer's job is not to provide the hiring recommendation. The interviewer's job is to assess a very specific competency in an interview. If you're providing context on that competency and then saying like, I did that, that's my job, now I'm handing it off to the next person, that actually shows that there's like trust in the team to ultimately make the right hiring decision versus like interviewer hears something that causes a red flag for them that ultimately jades them, gets them away from the competency that they're supposed to be assessing for. And then next thing you know, they're like having this completely different conversation. They didn't actually assess for the competency that they wanted, and they're the one trying to make the hiring decision. It's this conflation of the role that I think a lot of interviewers have that recruiters can absolutely help clarify. And I thought Jordan did an amazing job of articulating that.
Another point that leads on to, for me, is because I think you do get great companies who don't have the hiring manager-led model. They have more of a, obviously you get some companies that are very consensus driven, which I think is really hard to scale, but you get many others that are at least committee driven, right? It might not be the hiring manager's task at all, but like when we think about what great hiring looks like, I'm sort of more in the hiring manager camp because I think you get a lot of value out of the hiring manager saying, this is my call, and therefore I'm also going to invest in making that person successful. Whereas I think when you get this committee model, you run the risk of losing some of that, where it's more like, hey, you were handed these people, and like, again, you're just relying on that manager. If they might have disagreed with that decision, and you're just now relying on them being a good corporate citizen again to like make the best of it when they might have another inclination. The more human thing almost is to get hiring managers on the hook. This is the person that you thought was going to do this great job. It's part of your ability to operate is to hire great people. So, let's see. And if you get this wrong, totally fine. Just like make sure you get the next one right.
All right, everybody, you're going to love this episode. This is the first episode of 10x Recruiting. And here's my conversation with Jordan Mazer. This is the 10x Recruiting Podcast. Let's get after it. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. Jordan, thanks so much for being here, man.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on the pod.
I want to talk about this piece you just put out, which was brilliantly called Building a World-Class Interviewing Culture. And I want to ask you a few things like about it, but I feel like that piece was like written from like a passion place. Like, what was the genesis and why did you write it?
I actually originally wrote there's more to that, which is not actually posted, which was written to our founders, actually, when I first joined a16z's, along with 40 more pages of like how I think you can build a recruiting organization, a hiring organization, and how to vet talent, and et cetera. And yeah, it's me attempting to impart at least pieces of wisdom that I picked up from, more than a decade of just spending every waking hour thinking about hiring and nothing else.
Sick. All right. So let's get into a couple of things here. So your first point is companies should include interview participation, both the participation rate and the quality, as meaningful inputs for performance reviews. Why does nobody do that today?
I think it's number one that they don't understand that interviewing is not a naturally occurring capability. So I think most people want to believe that their ability to assess others is high quality because it's not only relevant in the context of their job, it's relevant every single day in every part of their life. You know, who they become friends with and what they do outside. Like, they just want to believe they have a good read on people. And they thus believe that when they get into the context of an interview, they can judge people accordingly because they've been doing this their whole life and clearly they're great at it. So I think that's like the first problem we face, is that it's just this competency that people don't accept that they might be really bad at. And it's not natural to sort of do a good job without a bunch of training and thought and sort of practice. So that's step one. I think step two is getting a very strong interviewing culture is a Herculean effort. And it doesn't just happen. It requires all of this time and effort to vet your interviewers, to check if they're doing what you expect them to do, to see if you're aligned on sort of the outcome of each one of those conversations. Do we see these answers in the same way? And if not, why not? And then to take action when it's not happening. So most people, I don't think, start as great interviewers. And therefore, that means there's a lot of sort of effort that's required to get people from not being good at it to being good at it. And so you have this added problem of like, if you agree that this is a competency that isn't just naturally occurring in spades, well, now you have to sort of put in all of this work and effort that most people just don't sort of prioritize because they have all these other product problems. They have all of these other sort of organizational problems that they're dealing with day to day. So I think it requires being counter to nature to accept this and then to deal with that problem.
So I have a story on this one. So back in 2015, 2016 at DoorDash, we had the hardest damn time hiring engineers. And this was like peak engineering hiring, especially like if you were hiring L5 and above. It was just a war for every single engineer. And what happened was the engineering managers were like looking at the recruiting team being like, why don't we have enough pipeline? Like, why are we not hiring fast enough? And the recruiting team went back to the engineering managers, were like, guys, you don't understand how difficult it is out there. We need to get you more involved. And the engineering managers were like, well, we don't want to spend more time in interviewing.
That's your job. Yeah.
What do you do here? Exactly. And so this went on for a quarter. We had like the worst hiring quarter. And so Andy Fang, our CTO, came to me and founder and was like, what should we do? And I was like, here's my like crazy idea. Let's get the engineering managers involved in the process and let's set a sourcing goal for them so they can actually experience like, you know, they have all these crazy qualifications. Like, let's actually get them into LinkedIn.
Can they find one person who meets all these? Yeah.
And then let's get them experiencing the 5% response rates, of which of those 5%, maybe 20% of those are actually interested in talking to us. And let's get them closer to the thing. And the most magical thing happened. It was like deep empathy, like right away. They're like, holy shit, nobody gets back to us. Why aren't they getting back to us? And I'm like, well, it turns out, it's 2016. It's like the most competitive time to hire an engineer in the history of the world. Like, we got to get creative. And so that actually led to us then doing other things, which was like the engineering managers actually had to take the first phone call. They actually ended up spending way more time than they expected. It obviously led to better results, hiring more. And then ultimately you kind of get to this point to where like you have a brand and people know who you are, and it gets easier as time goes on. But that initial phase I find is so time intensive, and there's just no fucking way around it.
You're talking about both sourcing and interviewing. Like I have never gotten an org to do what you just said you got an org to do, which is an incredible feat. And I have admiration for your salesmanship, and sort of making that happen. I certainly have seen varying degrees of like quality of interviewing though. And almost always it seems to be from a top-down orientation that drives it. So I give the example in the same blog that you're talking about when I was at Amazon. The organization states hiring is critically important. It lists it in its values. And it doesn't, the values at Amazon are not just words on a wall. They are really sort of the performance measures by which many people are assessed, both for the prospective employees, people they're hiring, they assess against this, and then also people who are getting promoted. And they would actually go back and read, all the scorecards from interviewers and say, that's not the bar. This isn't what it means to be an L5, right? And that's a bad thing when you get sort of caught in that scenario. And it wouldn't be your manager who's assessing you. It would be a bar raiser who was assessing your feedback from another team who didn't really care if you did well or not. They care if the organization does well. And so they want a really sort of healthy hiring culture. So like there were tiers of sort of incentive that created sort of awareness that interviewing and hiring was important, that sort of clarified it's not only important in word, but also in your monetary outcomes. If you get more scope, if your life changes, right? And by the way, it can also do the opposite. It can end up meaning that you no longer hold a job. And that's not only true for managers. They would say to any individual contributor, this is a skill set that you must hone, and you are going to participate in our hiring process because everyone at the company is responsible for helping hire. It's really interesting to see a company of, at the time when I was there, hundreds of thousands of people doing something that I would see smaller companies say is impossible to align 100 people on doing. So it's just, I think it starts from a position of power in the organization sort of stating and meaning, this is what we're going to do, and it cascades into the org.
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions I was just about to ask is like, well, if I'm a recruiter and I'm feeling like, I can't get people involved, I think the only answer is you have to get the highest levels bought in. Because if it's just like coming from it's an uphill battle. There's no way you get that battle solved unless the top of the org is saying this is a priority and must be prioritized.
Yeah. When I was at Riot, we had basically the opposite. We didn't have hiring was important, but it wasn't sort of codified as part of the performance. It was never part of how people were assessed, certainly not in sort of a systematized way. And all of the individuals that we got involved who wanted to improve our broader hiring process, they did it because they had some intrinsic motivation to do it. They cared deeply and they thought it was important, but every effort they made was actually at the expense of their career growth or at the expense of whatever their manager thought was most important at the end of the day, right? And so if they were out sort of like proselytizing and trying to reform other interviewers, and then their manager found out they were doing that instead of, insert, product requirement they're not meeting or timeline or whatever, they were working against the system. Even though the system wasn't designed to say you shouldn't do this, it just didn't actually value it. And so I just think it takes a org saying and really meaning we are going to sort of vet this, and then taking action when people don't actually meet the bar, it's just incredibly rare from my experience that people get sort of docked on a performance review or terminated if they're not participating in the interview process in a way that you would expect and creates healthy hiring outcomes.
Yeah, when we did add it to the performance review process for engineering managers. The other thing that happens too is when you put a bunch of people in a room and you put a leaderboard up of like how many people like were sourced last week or how many like coffee chats, all of a sudden it gets competitive. And people are like, oh shit, I do not want to be at the bottom of this list. So it actually deeply, deeply works. All right. I want to get to the next point that you make, which is allow interviewers the time needed to focus on high quality interviewing. So as we were just talking about, right, the majority of companies actually want to spend less time interviewing. But it appears that like the most talent dense cultures all deeply understand that hiring great people just takes time. It seems obvious to me, but like, where is the dissonance there? Like, why do people not understand this intrinsically?
I think this is just investment versus cost mentality. So if I step back and I think about organizations that I've interacted with as a candidate, And when, I've been sort of interviewing for a recruiting role or function, there are some number of people who see recruiting as just a cost center. It's just an expense. And that sort of means that they also see interviewing and hiring as an expense, a sort of thing they have to deal with. Some, on the other hand, see recruiting and interviewing as an investment. So I think the first top layer when you're sort of interacting with an organization is to figure out like, what's their mentality around hiring? Do they see it as a differentiating factor in their potential success? Most would say like, we want to hire the best, but most wouldn't say like, we want to build the best recruiting organization. We want to build the best and most effective interviewing culture. We want to, and we take time and effort and, it's something that we know should be a critical part of our function. And we're going to put dollars and effort into it versus like, we're going to literally try to make this as easy as possible. I think that efficiency mindset, while natural, is an indication that they don't quite sort of understand that, you don't need to just make this efficient. You need to make it really good. And really good often takes a lot of effort, more than you would sort of see in a standard environment. And, that's expensive. It's an expensive sort of orientation to take. So I imagine the smallest companies, there's just like a dollars and cents reality where like they cannot expend the amount of effort and time to like consistently find the best people, certainly not if they're trying to do it at scale. But the larger organizations, I think it's more of an ethos, more of a sort of way that they see this as differentiating or not.
Yeah. I found that founders either understand it like implicitly, or they have to learn it like by feeling a bad outcome. And, with it's kind of like if you're like in a situation like this as a recruiter and you're in the founder's just like, we don't want to spend more time on this, or like the EM's pushing against you. It's almost like they have to experience that bad hire themselves and to go through that process. And then for you to do the retro on what happened and what we could do better in the future. I don't think people will like, if you don't understand it intrinsically, I don't think you get it.
Yeah. Touching the stove certainly seems to teach people. And it is, I've certainly seen a pattern of younger or less experienced managers being more likely to have interesting perspectives or want to take greater risks in their hiring process. Because once you've managed any number of low performers, you come to realize that the challenges presented by having the wrong person are far worse than having no person at all, right? Like it would be, a preferable scenario to have no one rather than the wrong person. But I think when people are first sort of in the crucible of like, especially if they're a founder of, I need to hit a deadline, I'm running out of dollars, like it's hard for them to believe that having another person could actually be a hindrance. They just think like, oh, it'll be good until, to your point, they touch the stove, they get the wrong person and they find out like, oh, this person is literally dragging us back.
Yeah, it's funny. Like touching the stove is the perfect analogy because it's like with my daughter, it's like, stop getting near it, Aspen. Like just stop. And what's going to happen. She's going to have to touch it and experience it. Like we're all at the end of the day, just 4-year-olds. All right. Last point on the blog, which I thought was maybe your most controversial point, which you said, interviewers are not assessors of the candidate's fitness for the role. They're not?
No, definitely not. Like it's 0%. Okay. So in my belief system, there is a hiring authority, typically a hiring manager. Maybe it's the manager's manager, but let's just imagine whoever is the hiring authority is the go, no go on this candidate fits for the job. And a job is an assemblage of competencies. So, if I'm hiring a cashier or clerk, just to simplify it, maybe I need to make sure that they know arithmetic. And I also want to know that they have customer service skills, right? Say those are the two things that I'm looking for. I imagine there are more, but just imagine those are the two. If I ask one person to check and vet if they can do arithmetic, that they can add and subtract and they can, divide and multiply. If the person comes back and says, this person isn't a fit for the role, I would ask, can they do math? Right? Can they do arithmetic? Because that was my question. My question wasn't, are they a good cashier? My question was, can they do arithmetic? I find that most interviewers, they understand at first, and in most organizations where there's reasonable structure, that their job is to assess a competency or two competencies or whatever number of competencies. But then they see like a little like thing fly by. Like, wait, what did you just say? They hear something that makes them worried about some other skill, some other competency, some other deficiency that they believe that they've sort of held on to. And their immediate reaction is to put down whatever they're responsible for, assessing arithmetic in this context. And now they're on to this new thing. Like, oh, I don't think that you are like, the right comportment to be a cashier or clerk because maybe you have a negative attitude. So now they're going to ask 1,000 questions about attitude rather than about arithmetic. And so when they finish their interview, you ask, did you check on arithmetic? And they're like, oh, well, no, but I don't think that they have X, Y, or Z. Now, you can imagine when you have 7 people that are intended to cover different functions, if every single one of them is willing to sort of like reprioritize because they think that they are better suited to vet this other competency that was actually assigned to someone else, what they're saying is, I don't trust my colleagues. I don't think my peer can do a good enough interview. And so now I'm going to do their job for them. And in fact, while I do it, I'm going to ignore my own job and I'm going to make the assessment for the hiring manager. So this is just a roles thing that all of us should believe that our peers in the hiring team can do their job. And the sort of assemblage of those assessments should be brought up to a hiring manager for them to make their own assessment. Now, of course, a hiring manager can also be one of those interviewers. And so the hiring manager might be doing both. They might be doing one competency plus the whole sort of, perspective on the candidacy. But I think the minute you deputize interviewers to think that their job is to assess the totality of a candidate, all of them start behaving in this way that creates a lot of risk that every single interview process won't actually surface all the details that you need to, make an informed judgment on the candidate. And even more sort of like important to me is that none of those interviewers in most cases are the ones that will really have to deal with the consequences of the right or wrong hire. They might interact with that person in meaningful ways, but like the manager is literally going to have to be sort of responsible for the performance of that person. And so they should be thinking like, it's my job to make the right choice here. I don't get to sort of put that off and say that the other interviewers are responsible for coming up with the conclusion. Like it's my job to make the call on should this person join my team or not.
So by extension, then, I'm assuming you are not a fan of hiring committees.
So help me understand what you mean by hiring committee.
So, all right, I'll go back to my days at Google, right? So the way Google works is you have, somewhere between 4 and 6 interviewers. One of those is the hiring manager. The hiring manager works with the recruiter to put together a recommendation. And then ultimately the hiring decision is left with the committee. So the committee is the one saying yay or nay.
I'm more okay with this because the hiring manager is making a recommendation. And ultimately the recommendation is being approved or not. But really it is being solidified into like a comprehensive perspective by someone or some group of people who hopefully have the appropriate amount of context to make a choice. My general belief is that any interviewer during the interview does not have that context. Certainly not if they haven't sort of heard the feedback from every other interview and blah, blah, blah. So this is mostly about sort of stopping interviewers from doing a thing that constantly ruins interviewing processes rather than it is sort of bringing more people into the process later to sort of assess the outcome of that interview.
Got it. Yeah, that makes total sense, which is like interviewers have a role and they need to follow that role in order for us to actually get appropriate signal and the totality of what's happening with the candidate. And then regardless of what their score is for their specific module, they need to decide, like, that is what's going to happen here is not my decision. And I will decide and commit with the hiring manager, right? Because like they have more context than me.
Yes. And they have more ability to, change the path of this individual potentially, to set their goals, to train them, to, all this stuff. I think a lot of interviewers, the moment you start giving them this idea that they get to vote on the candidacy, they're just going to behave in weird ways in the interview. And it's just going to create a lot of wasted interview time and lack of information that's critical because you only have how much time, like in a long interview process, 6 hours or 8 hours, losing an hour or two is a big deal, right? It's effectively going to put you in a position where you've lost 15 or 25% of your total assessment criteria.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So what I'm hearing with your blog post is set these expectations, right? Make sure that you have buy-in from the top. But then undoubtedly, right, Jordan, like you're going to have that interviewer who has the God complex. And they're going to be like, well, I know better. And so what do you do with that person? Like, how do we like get that person like back in line? Like, how is that feedback coming from the recruiter? Is that feedback coming from the hiring manager? Like, how do we get them to understand, like, yes, we may have done things differently in the past, but now we've reset expectations and this is what we're doing moving forward.
I think this is like any other performance issue. You know, if you observe that they are doing something that you don't expect in their interviewing process, you know, there's a point at which that needs to be communicated to the manager, or the manager needs to be aware of it. If the manager is already treating this as a performance affecting competency, then they should be paying attention to how they interview and their interview notes already without the recruiter getting involved. But say they're not, I think the recruiter can at least once or twice say, hey, like, just a reminder, you know, this was the competency. I want to make sure that you're focused, whatever. But the recruiter certainly shouldn't be responsible for changing the behavior of all of the interviewers. Like, that interviewer is managed by someone. That manager is responsible for the performance of the people on their team. If there's a consistent pattern of a problem, then the manager should be engaging, having a conversation, seeing if it changes. If it doesn't, you know, what's going to happen from there? Hopefully they're being warned, like, this could be a problem. And ultimately, and this was my strong conviction even at Riot, like, they will be removed from the hiring process. And I would have managers who would fight tooth and nail to tell me, like, no, they shouldn't be removed. It's really important. And I would just be like, until you can tell me that they are going to behave differently, I'm not going to invite them on panels, right? And so I would eventually get to a point where I would extract them from the interviewing process. That wouldn't necessarily affect their ability to maintain a job at Riot, because Riot didn't see this as a critical function. Whereas, you know, at Amazon, if that was happening, it could mean that someone was no longer going to be promoted, or something was going to happen to their actual career.
Yeah. And honestly, in recruiting utopia, that's probably what it looks like. Like, if you get removed from the recruiting process, it's an oh shit moment of like, I got to get this figured out. And it's super serious. Versus I think at some companies you get removed from the recruiting process. You're like, great, This is what I've been hoping for the whole time.
Exactly. Which, you know, if that's the case, then they shouldn't be there anyways. If they really don't want to be there, you don't want them involved in the process.
Okay, exactly. All right. So I want to talk about the hill that I can't get off right now, which is we just spent 20 minutes talking about interviewing. And I think interviewing is broken. Like, we do all of these behavioral interviews and we get very little signal from them. Even if the interview is structured, I think the data is like, we're getting like 60 to 70% signal on what's actually happening in these conversations when it's done like perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I believe work trials are the future of interviewing. And there's companies like Linear to where like literally every single role has like a work trial associated with it. You have to like go present, you have to explain, you have to answer questions on it. And it's typically a problem that the company's actually working on right now, which I find to be the best way to get signal. Do you agree with that?
Somewhat. So I'll start with
yeah. Tell me more.
Okay, so I think that at done best, it's maybe a little bit better than 70%. I think it's like 80%. The behavioral interviewing, it's still imperfect, but like I think it can get up there. And my sense is that very large companies. So we're going to sort of talk about the stratification of maturity and size of business. Larger companies, I don't think have the ability to consistently use work trials because they're competing in a market, and the market, there's some other company that isn't doing that and is moving more quickly than them. Often the work trial takes a lot of time or effort. They might need to be there for, 10 hours or 15 hours, whatever it is. And so they're in a sort of position of needing to react, certainly if they're hiring at scale and they need to have like a significant market share of the engineers, especially engineers is what I'm thinking of, that are available in the marketplace. So I will just say for larger businesses, I worry because I think that makes them likely uncompetitive. And that talent will just go to an easier opportunity. Even if that other company is taking more risk in their assessment, that doesn't really matter to the candidate if they're getting access to a better job, right? And so like, it's just the reality of if the candidate has an easier path at another organization to get the same amount of money or purview or whatever, then I think they're going to take that path. In smaller organizations, in all of the startups that I work with today in my role, I advise them to certainly do work trials if they can, to do contract roles if they can, to do any amount of sort of like they're going to get a test. And I think it's easier for them to, number one, explain that to a candidate. Like, hey, we only have 2 years or 1.5 years of runway. We only have 7 heads. If this one head doesn't work out, like it will be fatal, not only for you, but for us, for everyone involved. And like you and us want to be as convicted as possible that this is the right job and that you're capable of doing it and that we fit with you and that you think that you want to work with us. So I think the sort of the sell to a candidate is easier for that type of process and for it to be more cumbersome and for it to be more challenging and take more time. And all of the things that I think typically come with a work trial or certainly a contract arrangement. But as you scale up, I think it's harder and harder to consistently do with a large share of people. The other thing that I would say is I've worked in at least one organization that was getting at times was sued by candidates who had worked on projects that seemed like they were relevant to what the company was facing today, where they thought their answers or what they were doing was sort of used after the fact. So
Wow.
the company asked them, to do something that was unpaid in those contexts.
Yeah, that's the
and
problem.
the person thought their ideas got sort of put into practice. So some asterisk around risk and consideration of like protecting the business from that kind of stuff.
You've actually seen a lawsuit in a situation like that?
I have. Yes, I have seen a
Wow.
lawsuit in a situation like that. We didn't lose the lawsuit, but that doesn't matter, right? Like the reality of lawsuits, certainly when you're in a larger organization, is they still have to fight them. And that costs a lot of money, regardless of the outcome of the lawsuit. Yeah.
And time. Okay. So the lawyers on this one were actually like right with their theory that you could potentially get sued. And probably, I'm assuming the larger you get, the more likely it can happen to you.
Yeah, because the frequency of your interviews is increasing and it just takes, some tiny margin of people to sort of bring the lawsuit and become a problem for you.
Wild. Okay, so let's transition to talking about your current role at Andreessen. So you are primarily focused on helping early stage companies like figure out recruiting. Can you break down the process of what you do once a new portfolio company is onboarded?
Okay, so, we have 200 something companies. The team that I manage is 4 people large, including myself. We are not a substitute for a recruiting organization for any one of these companies. So I just want to clarify, my
That's
relationship
what I wanted to ask first.
all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So you guys are you guys actually doing the recruiting or are you guys more like the teach them how to fish model?
It's a little bit of both. So my belief is that in hiring, the vast majority of people do not take recruiters seriously. And the reason they don't is because there's so many bad recruiters. It's such an easy entry job, just like sales. And I think the result of that, or real estate, the result of that is like, there's this cadre of people who had no professional intent. They sort of stumble into recruiting. They're like, okay. Engineers interact with these people or product managers interact with these people. These people had been, the product managers and engineers have been like, super set on their careers their whole life. And they sort of have this denigrating opinion of most of recruiting. And I think this is important to understand because that means that to a degree, we're always working from a deficit. And why that matters to me is in this role, especially where I'm not on their team directly, I'm part of some central org, I don't sort of interact with them as often as I would if I were sort of there and with them all the time. We need to start by showing them value. So if we can introduce them to fantastic talent, if we can make a placement on their team, to me, that is the price of admission in most cases for respect. And once we've shown them like, hey, we made an impact on your business. And by the way, when we gave you that advice on blah, 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 it turned out exactly as we said, they start to sort of get the impression like, okay, maybe we'll listen to you. So I wish being at a16z meant like de facto, like there's trust, but like recruiters start so low that even the like halo of a16z only takes me so high. And as a result, we need to like sort of set the impression and then we can hopefully teach to fish. But I think ultimately the best thing that we can do for our portfolios is create sort of an inbound funnel. We use a bunch of content marketing. We bring candidates into our world. we start assessing those people, and then we have this arbitrage experience of trying to find the right fit across the portfolio. And as we do this, like Plinko or whatever it's called, the game where, the quarter falls down, as we do this exercise and we eventually get hires in different places, each time we get a little bit of sort of authority and ability to give them advice from, I think, a position of strength. Now, is it always the same? No. Do some come in and immediately sort of listen and sort of, want to learn? Yes, but like plenty also want to touch the stove, and that's okay. That's the reality of, like we said, humans. We're all like internally the 4-year-old. And I think that's even more the case when the person you're getting advice from looks like the person who never actually has something useful to say, at least in your professional experience.
Yeah. It's a really important framework that you just laid out that I want to underscore for people, which is if you want respect, first deliver value.
Yes.
It works in almost every aspect actually of life, not even just professionalism, but like, deliver value first. And then, because there's this soundbite that like makes me want to throw up, which is like, oh, I want a seat at the table. And it's coming from this like privilege, like I should be there because I'm in the building. And it's like, no. Just because you're in the building doesn't mean you like get to have an opinion on how things are run. Like you get to have an opinion on how things are run once you start adding significant value to the business.
Yes.
That's really good. The other thing I'll underscore is that it is a sad truth that the majority of recruiters are terrible. And, I think if you're listening to this pod right now, instead of getting mad when I say that, I think instead what you should do is actually lean into what Jordan just said, which is like, you have a higher bar to overcome because the industry is bad. And the faster you realize that, and the faster that you deliver value, especially consistent value, the more you will be thought of as like, oh my God, this person is amazing, because you're going to stand out so much. Right. So I think it's like, when I say those things, I think people can sometimes get frustrated by them. But in fact, I think it's opportunistic that if you are really good at delivering value in your job as a recruiter, the business is going to love you for forever.
I've thought about this a lot. Like, would I have preferred to have been stack ranked when I was at Amazon, for example, against the engineers who all went to MIT and Stanford and who like literally all day did leak codes and like their profession was their life and that's it? Or would I prefer to be stack ranked against the recruiters? And the sad answer is definitely against the recruiters. And I think the other part of this is not personal. When someone looks at me and they have the long memory of all the bad recruiters and they impose some version of me that isn't me, it's not about me. It's about all of those experiences. And so like it can be dispelled pretty easily, to your point. Like the minute you sort of show like this exhibition of capability and awareness, it does just sort of like go away very quickly. But I think a lot of people get stuck in this like, woe is me and how dare they think that and blah, blah, blah. Cause I think it's about them, and it's not. It's about this like all these other people and the history of that person's experience that they've interacted with.
Yeah. The comment what you just described actually is how I designed my career. So when I started the Apollo Group, and I got a job in recruiting, and then I flipped over to the marketing team. I was like, oh my God, it's so much harder over here. And these people are wicked, like especially performance marketing people are wicked smart. And I was like, ooh, I think I'm going to ascend a lot faster if I go back to the recruiting side. I've never said that publicly before, but it's so true. Like it really is an opportunity if you are, at a tech company. Like you can stand out a lot faster in recruiting and HR because the bar is just objectively lower.
Yeah. And there's this I've watched this interview with Jeff Bezos where he's talking about he wanted to be a theoretical physicist and how he got all A's, and he's in some class, and he's asked this question. He spent hours trying to figure out the answer. He can't figure it out. And he asked one of his classmates who solved the problem in his head. He said that was the moment he realized he should not be a theoretical physicist, right? Like, because he is not competitive. And I have this recognition. I'm probably not competitive in these other places, but this is where I'm good, and so like, great.
Hell yeah. Jordan, there's like a million more things I want to ask you, but I'm just going to put the gun to your head right now and say, will you come back? Because there's more I want to click into with you on
Sure.
a round two.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, of course.
All right, man. This was a blast. Thanks so much for the time.
Thank you. Glad to be here.